U issa bi pjaċir nilqa' fostna virtualment il-keynote speaker ta' din is-serata, Dr. Becky Parry. Ħaneqleb ftit bl-Ingliż biex anke tkun tista' tifhimni. Dr. Parry is a lecturer at the University of Sheffield, and she is the program director of the MA Digital Literacies, Culture and Education. Today, Dr. Parry will be talking to us about practicing creative habits of mind in digital play. I therefore invite Dr. Parry to give us her keynote speech. Thank you.
Hello, everyone, and many, many thanks for inviting me. It's a great honour to be here from a rainy Sheffield in the north of England. And I don't know if you can see that it's also kind of quite dark, and I'm in my son's bedroom where I have my kind of temporary study. And these, I think, are conditions that we're all working in. I think from hearing you all present, although I wasn't able to understand everything, I certainly heard some words around the issues of the pandemic and switch to online learning and us all working from home as being things that you're all contending with as well as we are. So it's a real honour to be here under your, I'm sure, challenging circumstances, but it's also really exciting to hear how committed you are to developing digital literacies and considering digital citizenship and really thinking about what that means. And I was really interested to hear the reference to the idea of being able to adapt to change. And sometimes I think we need to do more in terms of actually making the change or encouraging children and young people to feel that they can themselves make the change rather than simply adapt. But that isn't really the focus of my talk. So my focus of my talk today is about a big research project that we undertook here at the University of Sheffield. And I came into researching children's media engagements because I had developed an interest through teaching. So my first career was working as a secondary teacher and really getting to understand that children's media texts, the texts that children loved, the digital media they engaged with were actually incredibly important to their lives and really had quite a substantial impact on literacy. So observing that as a teacher has been something that I've now got the privilege of being able to research within my lecturing at the University of Sheffield. And I would also say that something that I think will hopefully cut through this presentation and this work is a real emphasis on play and playfulness, and the idea of play not only being for children in the early years, but the importance of understanding opportunities for play and playful thinking as children progress through school and into their kind of secondary education and even beyond that. So if I could have the next slide, please. The research project that I want to talk to you about, I'm going to talk to you about the overarching project first, and then I want to just share with you a very small section of the research that really focused on creativity. But the overarching research question that drove this new research project was this question: does digital play provide children with opportunities for the development of creativity? And this was a broad question amongst a number of other questions that we were asking with a number of partners. And obviously this is a question that preoccupies many of us. We're all very aware children are playing games, they're going on apps, they're engaging with digital technologies as part of their play, they're part of the landscape. But what we understand less perhaps is what that play looks like in relation to traditional play and also how it relates to creativity. So this is going to be a kind of a strong focus of this talk and was also a strand within a wider project. Okay. So the Creativity, Technology and Play research project was, we've described it as a co-produced study. And this is because we worked with a number of partners. So the University of Sheffield worked with the University of Cape Town. We also worked with the Lego Foundation, who were also the funder, and a commercial research company that based in Leeds in the UK called Dubbit. And it's important to say, so these questions and also our approach were really formed through a partnership. Perhaps that's something that, well, certainly in my own experience, that's something that's less, we don't so often get a chance to do that. So it's a really rich opportunity to combine our research questions and kind of try and come up with a framework and a methodology that would address those questions in ways that each of the partners was signed up to. And that presents interesting challenges. I won't talk about those particularly, but if you wanted to ask questions about them, I'd be happy to answer. Okay. So as I've said, we have to acknowledge, and the literature tells us, that there is an incredible amount of technology in children's play landscapes. Some of you may know of the work of Professor Jackie Marsh here at the School of Education in Sheffield, and Jackie's work has really been inspiring for our department, really establishing the important role of digital technologies and also kind of questioning some assumptions that are often made about the potential difficulties and challenges, and obviously the particular concern that some educators have and some parents may have about the role of digital technology potentially displacing what they might see as more important activities. So we wanted to ask a question about the role of digital technology in play, but we also wanted to take seriously that concern and look at whether we felt there was evidence of play with digital technologies hindering the wider sorts of play that we would expect to see young children doing. Okay. Just to start with, I'm not going to try and define play because the concept of play is widely debated and really contested. Brian Sutton Smith talks about it as this kind of ambiguous idea. And yet Elizabeth Wood in our own department would argue we kind of all know what it is when we see it. So what we decided to do in this study is to sort of look at qualities of play, as Abel and his and colleagues describe. So these are kind of qualities that we recognized in play, and this is what we used in the study. And these were the idea that play appears to be purposeless, so there's not a set objective. It's voluntary, the child has chosen to do it. It might be outside the ordinary. It's fun, but there are also rules that come from within the play. So these were quite important understandings of play that we drew on. Okay. What we also drew on, so the Lego Foundation, as some of you may be aware, some of you may have seen their other forms of research, they're really interested in looking at play and learning and how that relates to digital technologies. And they have been using this particular framework, which we embraced and well, certainly tried out within this research project. And what they had found in a previous study was the idea that play happens when the learning activity is, so these are their kind of key terms, so that the learning activity is joyful, when it's meaningful, children find meaning in it, it's active, it involves iterative thinking, so experimentation, hypothesis testing, and it's social, it involves children's social interactions. And we looked at these as trying to identify in the activities that we observed whether those were kind of conditions that were in place when we were seeing play. And that's quite a big feature of the overall project. Okay. I'm not going to talk in huge depth about the aims. The important things are to emphasize the relationship between the technology, the relationship between technology and digital play, and then how that impacts on or makes opportunities for learning and creativity. And we have a range of research objectives, and this is where we did that kind of difficult work of reaching a mutual understanding of what it is we were looking at. So our research objectives are quite wide. If you want to have a look at them, I've got the link for the main report and you can have a look at that. But if we can just look at the next slide, you'll see that the research questions hopefully are a little bit more easy to engage with quickly. So we were interested in each of these research questions in the project. So for example, the relationship between children's use of technology and their play in everyday life. And each of these questions was equally important and was researched across the project. But my colleague Fiona Scott, who took the focus of research question 4 that looked at the relationship between play and technology and creativity, and she looked at question 5, how do parents and other adults facilitate children's play, and I looked at what is the relationship between play, technology and creativity. I do know what I studied, honest. So yeah, if I could have the next slide, please. Now, the methodology that we were chosen for this study was a mixed method. So we used quantitative methods. There was a large survey that went out in both South African context and in the UK. But we also undertook a lot of qualitative research. And for me, the quantitative research was really, really useful and told us things that certainly relate to existing data sets where we can see patterns of children's use of media. So we have, it's kind of confirmatory data that we have from the quantitative study. Particularly, some of you may be familiar, we have in the UK an annual survey of children's media use, so it resonates with things in that the Ofcom survey that we see each year. But we also wanted to make sure that children's own voices were represented in the study, and also the parents were incredibly important. And although in each of the families we worked with, there was one kind of central child, we were also very interested in how they related to their siblings. And as you'll imagine, when you're in the room with a group of children, siblings, you're never going to leave one of them out. It would just not be appropriate. So actually we took interest in all of them and collected data from all of them. And we used things that kind of sprung a little bit from the children's own interests. So they were interested in, the parents were interested in using WhatsApp. The children took great fascination in our own research tools, and so we decided to give them GoPro cameras. And they also had some creative activities, including Lego bricks and other things to play with to generate discussion within the research. So it was a mixed methods and a quite a wide-ranging number of approaches. Okay. In terms of who took part, so we had parents of children aged 3 to 11 were the people that conducted the survey, and you can see, so over 1,000 were participated from South Africa and over 2,000 in the UK. And then in each country, we worked with 30 parents who took place in follow-up interviews. And then, for example, in the UK, we had 10 families who we did much more detailed work with, where we went to the home, we also visited them in school, and we also visited them in sort of informal settings that they might go to, clubs. Some of them went to, I don't know whether you would have brownies or guides, kind of after school activities that children enjoy. So we saw them in different contexts, and that was important for the range of data that we managed to gather. And we also undertook interviews with the children in school towards the end of the whole study. Okay. Just to reassure, we obviously undertook an ethical process and gained the consent of all of the participants. And probably a notable thing to say here is that it was really important, because we were working with such a range of ages in terms of young people and children, to be not to consider the informed consent to kind of just say tick the box and off we go, but actually to think of this as much more ongoing, and for the researchers to gauge if a child perhaps no longer seemed interested, particularly as this is play and this is important to their own kind of engagements with the world. They're making decisions about play, so we didn't want to kind of push them too much into undertaking things, particularly, you know, just for the sake of the research. So the ethics process was also kind of something that we considered not just at the beginning, but throughout the process. Okay. And just to give you a little taste here, you can see, so the UK, this just gives you the numbers for the number of survey respondents, but also the kind of overall number. So you can see the amount of data. There was a lot of data, and I've enclosed a link here too. This is just to the summary of the report. There is a much longer report which you could access if you were interested. I'm just going to, in the next slide, just give you a few kind of headlines really about the findings for the project. So probably unsurprisingly, we found that there was really significant evidence that playing with digital technologies in its different forms has a range of positive effects on children's knowledge, creativity and skills. Now, again, the overarching project really drills down on each of these areas in detail. So, and I obviously can't present all of that here to you today, so I'm just going to choose one example. But a couple of things that I just also want to mention, there was really interesting evidence that quality play with digital technologies was important for developing skills, technical skills, wider skills such as social skills, emotional well-being, family relationships and creativity. And I think that distinction of quality play is important. And I'll just link it as well to the idea in the final paragraph about the really important role adults play. So we found that parents and educators, the way that they engaged with children's digital play had a really profound effect on the extent to which it became high quality, rich experiences of play. It's also really worth emphasising that, of course, there were big differences between the UK and the South Africa context, particularly in terms of ownership and use of technology and access to Wi-Fi. So again, that's kind of detailed in the report, in the wider report. If I can have the next slide. So some recommendations from the overarching report were that children need help to become more social in their digital play. So some of the examples of digital play that we saw where children were really engaging in a really interesting mix of complex tasks were often those that they were doing in partnership with either other children or with adults. So there's a real role for supporting them to open up those social opportunities that we can take as both educators and parents. We also found, and I'll talk a little bit about this in relation to video games, so we found that children needed opportunities to take the initiative in their digital play. And I would say this is a real message, not just for adult educators and parents, but really also for designers of video games. So that idea that you're building in choice and building in different ways that children can initiate activity in games, in apps, in other forms of technology proved to be really important. So children had some autonomy, some agency over their play. We felt that they, sorry, previous slide, please. We felt that they needed to have a varied diet in terms of digital technologies. That seemed to be important, that really playing on one thing all the time, although we saw that, and it wasn't something that was particularly negative, but the more various types of play we saw, the range of different skills we saw children develop. And so this kind of further to points, this idea of being an adult being actively engaged proved to be really important. And we also found that many games and apps need to think quite carefully about how they reflect diversity in society. And again, there were a number of examples that are listed in the full report. Okay, next slide. So what I want to do, obviously it's not possible for me to share with you all of the findings in detail, but I wanted to share with you a particular focus on creativity and digital play. And I'll just explain how I undertook this as briefly as I can. So what I decided to do in looking at creativity in particular was that I adopted an existing taxonomy of digital play that had been developed by Jackie Marsh and based on a previous taxonomy of play, and I'll share that with you in a moment just briefly. And I used this to categorize the different sorts of play that we were seeing, and my focus was on the 10 families in the homes in the UK in Sheffield. So I looked at the video data, the transcriptions, the audio data, the images, a whole range of data. But what I was looking for there was sort of types of digital play, and that enabled me to select instances that I would then kind of went on to analyze further. Okay. And I just wanted to show you the taxonomy of play, which I'm sure many of you that perhaps work with early years children will be very familiar with this or similar frameworks. And this is a kind of long list, so 16 criteria that relate to, so symbolic play here, for example, occurs when children use an object to stand for another object. So we're all kind of familiar with that idea. And what Marsh and colleagues did, if I can just switch to the next slide, is to adapt each of these. So if we just look at the first one, it's the idea again of a symbolic play, but here we're looking at occurs when children use a virtual object to stand for another object. So for example, an avatar's shoe becomes a wand. And again, we saw examples of this same kind of play. So there were parallels between the different types of play. Equally with rough and tumble play, we saw this particularly actually in a past project in Club Penguin, where children were playing this kind of rough and tumble, bumping into each other deliberately, kind of quite a physical sort of play, but obviously a virtual physical sort of play. And yeah, if I could have the next slide, thank you. And this is the remainder of the sort of traditional play list. And here I just wanted to kind of focus for a moment on the number of different ways that play, role play, imaginative play is described. So there's role play and imaginative play, fantasy play, deep play, all of these relate to a kind of an idea of when a child enters a fictional world and in their play, and it becomes an important aspect of their of developing activities which they then learn from. And we've all seen this in early childhood. We see children playing games, that's such as we see where they're becoming really immersed in a playful world, and quite often that's based on popular culture. So I don't know, so my children particularly play things like Bug's Life and Spider-Man, and all of the Star Wars films were important. So we've also seen children do that, but we wanted to look at how that worked in digital texts themselves. Were those digital texts offering that same kind of fictional world that children could play in? Okay, next slide. And these are just, again, the way that Marsh and her colleagues have kind of adapted these traditional forms of play into a digital context. And just to say, so if you can see that they're doing very similar things here, but in online spaces. And for example, the adopting of kind of roles for sociodramatic play is really made very available in many digital media. Often digital media invites children to adopt a character. Okay. Once I'd kind of gone through the data and identified lots of examples of digital play, I then wanted to map these against a form of it's kind of a model of creativity developed by Bill Lucas and colleagues. And here Lucas looked at the literature, looked at what creativity, how it had been described, how it had been observed in education, and using that literature he came up with a list of 5 criteria, 5 dimensions that he describes as the creative habits of mind. And these are habits of mind that children need to develop in order to be creative. Now, there's a much more detail about each of these that's available, but I'm going to focus on 2 in particular, which is the inquisitive and imaginative, and I'll explain a little bit more about how they've been modelled by Lucas. But just to say that the paper that this work is based on obviously deals with the others in more detail, and I'd be happy to share that at a later stage. So next slide, please. And I just wanted to show you this one because one of the reasons that I particularly like Bill Lucas's approach is that it's very grounded in classroom practice, particularly not necessarily just in the UK, but actually more widely internationally. And this is a school that I've visited on a number of occasions, Thomas Tallis School it's near London, and they have really adopted the Tallis habits in partnership with all the children. So the young people view their education as all the time what they're needing to demonstrate is the ability to be inquisitive, collaborative, persistent, disciplined, imaginative, and that's unpacked in a number of ways. So it's unpacked in terms of how they might expect young people to behave, but it's also unpacked in terms of the different pedagogical approaches that might make it happen. So really worthwhile visiting the school's website and also maybe looking at Bill Lucas's work. And what I did, if I could have the next slide, is really we decided to focus on video games in particular because we saw very rich opportunities of digital play. But it's really important to say we actually saw rich digital play that led to creativity across a wide range of digital texts. And again, there is a paper in development that explains that in more detail, particularly things like Alexa and the kind of tools that children have at home that you might not even expect to support creativity. Another reason for looking at video games is because often they are the source of anxiety, parents perhaps particularly, but also teachers quite worried about the amount of time children are playing on video games. It felt it was perhaps useful to be exploring and unpacking what was going on in children's video games in relation to their play and in relation to how that supported creativity. Next slide. I wanted to just add that one thing that we noticed as well was that there was digital play that went on that was away from the technology. And I think that's something that's really important to mention. So there was digital play that happened that was about Minecraft that was played by children on the way home from school on the street. And again, I'm sure all of you, this will be very familiar. We know children play based on films and stories that they've encountered. So they do this in relation to games as well. And I think this is something important and sometimes gets overlooked. Okay, so in terms of the idea, sorry, can I go back a slide, please? Yeah, in terms of the idea of the inquisitive that is proposed by Lucas. So he talks about these aspects of being inquisitive, that children need to wonder and question, they need to explore and investigate, and they need to challenge assumptions. And within that, he's kind of pointing to a development of criticality. And obviously critical literacy and criticality is very important to all of our thinking about children's digital literacies. Okay. Now, we had one family that was playing Minecraft in the study, and they had literally never played it before. So we were really, really lucky because we got to see them playing it for the first time. One of the researchers was just in the room with them as they were trying it out. So this is quite unusual data. And we had another family that had just been playing it for a short time. And I've got quite a lot of examples for you here. So I'm just going to talk briefly about each one, but also just read you the comments. Now, these were not consecutive comments. These were taken from a period of probably about half an hour of playing on Minecraft. And this is one boy, Noah's, kind of comments. So if you imagine the researcher is in the room and is acting in the role of a kind of just interested adult, but isn't actually asking any questions. But Noah is kind of thinking aloud. And as he starts playing in survival mode, but he quite quickly switches to creative mode. And he tries to draw on his previous experience of games, but he's saying, look, you can't die. I'm on creative mode, so you can't die. So this is a new phenomenon for him. This is something exciting, and he's questioning that out loud. He's thinking about it and reflecting on it. Then he says, I don't get that. Why is coal above ground? Coal is always underground. So he's kind of drawing on his experience of, his knowledge from home, or his understanding of coal and what coal is, and kind of questioning why in the game is something different going on. And then he says, oh, I'm making a lift. I need some redstone. So he's starting to understand that what we're in, the space that we're in, is about construction, about building, and that you need tools to build. Okay. So I was identifying quite quickly there were lots of examples of Noah being inquisitive and also kind of questioning, because he was verbalizing his experience. If you imagine, he was also very excited, so he's quite motivated, so he's being curious, he's using kind of trial and error approach, and he's kind of thinking aloud here. He says, very, very complicated. I'm a redstone master somehow. And he didn't understand how he'd become a redstone master, but he was prepared to go along with that uncertainty, prepared to kind of just try it out. He was unfamiliar with the territory. And I wondered, as I'm listening to this, which is something I frequently do, how would this look, or how would this feel if he was talking in the same way about a book or a film? He's in that space, and he's actually able to be personified in that space somehow. So it's a kind of, it demonstrates helpfully some of the differences that there are in particular media texts such as video games. And again, you can see wait, I haven't tried this before. Oh, if you go to the top, what do you actually see? So lots of evidence of wondering, asking questions there. And he realizes that there aren't levels. He initially tries to use the usual strategy he'd have in games, which is to kill the first thing that comes to sight, but then he decides that isn't what he's going to do, that maybe doesn't particularly work, and so and actually he hasn't got the tools to do that, so he starts kind of wandering around there, and then he starts into this quite interesting phase. So he's talking, just imagine if there was a king in there. I never noticed that, he says later, and oh, this is a weird ridge. So he's paying attention and noticing, and clearly mostly these things would be happening as children engage with things, but in their heads. We don't see these thoughts, hear these thoughts, but we were lucky to kind of capture some of that, and it really demonstrated to all of us the kind of richness that was going on there, and probably for anybody that's a regular gamer, not that surprising, but for those of us that tend to game only for education kind of motivation, it was really interesting to see just how immersed Noah became, how quickly, and how curiosity and that kind of inquisitive habit were being developed in that space. Okay. So we would argue that he was acting on curiosity, he was experimenting, he was applying a trial and error approach in order to understand these new rules and to understand the rules about redstone. So definitely we would be arguing that this could be categorized as digital play. Really interesting, that kind of toleration of uncertainty, and even though he got the result he wanted and he didn't really understand why, he was developing knowledge that he could then build on, but he is asking questions, and we felt that showed evidence of kind of criticality developing. He's not just accepting that, oh, the coal is on the surface. He's kind of questioning why that coal is on the surface. So he's developing that critical questioning kind of set of habits that Lucas discusses. Okay. Now, I'm a bit worried about sharing this with you because it's a bit complicated for me. I'm hoping that you, some of you particularly who will be regular FIFA players or have family who play FIFA or some version of it, may understand, and this will all be very intuitive. But this was this particular focus is on being imaginative and what's offered in a game like FIFA to a group of children. Now, according to Lucas, the ideas about being imaginative are to do with playing with possibilities, developing ideas, trying things out, thinking in an iterative way, enabling connections to be made between unrelated things. And Lucas talks about intuition being an important aspect of this. Now, what's probably important to say even at this stage is that as we were looking at this data, we could see that this definition of imaginative wasn't enough, that there's more going on in terms of imagination, and particularly the entering into a fictional world that were important. But I'll move to the next slide and just share with you a little bit of the data. Sorry, if we can skip that slide. Yes, so So we had quite a few families playing football-based games, but in particular, we had one family who were really playing a lot of FIFA. There were 4 brothers in that family, and so they were quite competitive in their playing of FIFA, but they were also competitive in terms of their playing of football and also in terms of their allegiance to football teams. And we saw in their playing of video games, we saw evidence of role play, of fantasy play and imaginative play. And we, as I said before, we found these in a whole range of different engagements with play. Actually, not so much in the apps and software that have been designed for education purposes. They tended to be very didactic, more in those that were very story orientated. But so this idea of role play, fantasy play, imaginative play in relation to FIFA, I don't know how many of you have played FIFA, but you'll perhaps know this is where you adopt the role. You are playing, you kind of do play the game as if you were a footballer to some extent, but you're actually also much more importantly a manager, and you're doing all the things that a football manager would do. Next slide, please. And I'm going to focus on Hanif in particular. So Hanif was age 9 when we undertook the study, and as you may have gathered already, he was quite obsessed by Lionel Messi, and we found all sorts of things going on when he was playing, and particularly what you might expect to see is quite a lot of locomotor play. So play that was physical. He's using the devices, he's moving, and he's kind of developing some kind of locomotive skills. But what we also saw, we were starting to compare with what you see when children play in the park, when they play football and they might shout, "Oh, it's a brilliant goal by Messi," and they're talking about themselves. And they're in that sort of very pleasurable moment where they imagine that they're Messi and they've scored in front of a big crowd and they've got all of that sense of achievement. Now, there are similarities between those, but what we started to draw on some research from the field of video games research rather than education. And we looked at the work of Sikart, who talks about some of the differences. If I could have the next slide. Sorry, and what Sikart suggests is that games like FIFA are very procedural. So again, any of you that have played will know that you have to do a whole range of activities. It's to do with strategies, team selection. You're doing quite a lot of numerical manipulation. Sikart even argues that you're learning to understand how computer programs, how the algorithms work, so that you can start to interpret the rules. So there's this very kind of procedural approach that you're within, and so you're both doing a procedural approach and you're within a kind of a fictional world that you're really familiar with. And just as an aside, we saw an awful lot of discipline in relation to, so another of the habits of mind in relation to the playing of FIFA, and particularly the boys in the family would go and look at YouTube tutorials in order to kind of improve skills, and then kind of develop those as they went along back into the game. Okay, next slide. And this is the bit that I'm still working my way through in terms of how to articulate it in a way that I think does justice to what we were seeing. But Sikart talks about, of course, it's not possible to be Messi. When we play imaginative play or role play, we can pretend we're Messi. We can do that in the park. We can do that in the game. But it's not possible to achieve you're not going to be Messi in that space. But what Sikart argues that I think is helpful here is that it is possible to achieve what Messi achieves through the kind of impersonation that you're doing within the game. Now, some people I don't know enough about Lionel Messi to know whether that's a good thing or not. But the idea that you're actually in role as somebody, so whether or not you're good at football doesn't matter. You're engaging in a game that is fulfilling because you're able to play it well, but with other kinds of strategies, drawing on other kinds of strategies. And as I said, they're not just players, they're also managers. They have kind of strategic role in the game, and they're developing a whole range of skills. And Michael Desawani talks about this idea of being the player and being the manager as a form of kind of bringing yourself into being. So you're adding to your identity. These games events, these narratives are important to your identity, your developing identity. Sorry, next slide, please. And another video games researcher, Mitt Gutsch, talks about, he did a lot of research with men who had played FIFA and other football games, and he kind of collects together these interviews and gives each of the participants a playography. And what he found was they were really enmeshed. So you had hometown teams who were passionate for sport, and you had your physical engagement with football, your online engagement with football. So all these knowledges, and particularly for this family, the sort of sibling rivalry between the boys, were really important aspects. They were kind of written in. There were histories, so the boys were really familiar with each other's previous games. They could tell stories of their previous games. And I don't know, anybody, I have 3 sons, so anybody else who's heard of a story of, oh, I've scored this amazing goal, and you find that it was a goal in the game. These are still important, effective moments that are supporting a really deep engagement in a fictional world, and are therefore worth us paying attention to. So next slide. And what we're arguing there is that this sort of identity work is not strongly featured in Lucas's creative habits of mind model. So we wanted to maybe extend the model a little bit. We're going back to that model and trying to address it, to include, in terms of a habit of mind, this ability to sort of suspend disbelief and be really immersed in a story world. Robson argues that this is a form of play, the most likely of any activity to lead to high levels of creative thinking, and involving kind of purposeful actions and self-regulation, which are really important for kind of cognitive development. So actually quite exciting to see these possibilities in video games that are perhaps more positioned as purely entertainment, as having quite strong potential for developing skills. Sorry, next slide. And it's just in conclusion, we wanted to emphasize that on the surface, many of these games, Mario Kart, FIFA, they don't necessarily particularly look like they offer rich spaces for role play, but on closer inspection, we found that the involvement that children and young people had in those fictional characters was actually very important, and involved the following or understanding of existing fictional, implicit social rules, and being involved in that character moved them from kind of locomotor play and rough and tumble play into much more immersive and mature play, which we felt was something to really focus on, and both for implications for us in terms of understanding video games, but also in thinking about, well, how do we understand creative habits of mind? These are creative habits of mind that are also important. And next slide. And I just wanted to end really by saying that we think that the complexity of children's digital play made it necessary to revisit these creative habits of mind. And particularly, one of the reasons for doing that is that we, going back to the main study, found lots of compelling evidence for the role of the adult in supporting that play, and being part of that play as the boys were developing their playography, their stories within the games, the football games. Their mum particularly was really engaged watching with them, and remembered those stories, and they were shared stories. So parents and teachers have a real role to play in almost kind of, I'm using this slide, the image in this slide, as an analogy really of bringing sustenance to the play, also kind of developing it, so enabling the play to carry on. So here, this is a traditional role play. The children are, I think, in a train, but somebody has bought them their lunch. So I think it's pretend lunch, but all the same, they're engaging in their fictional world. They're supporting that fictional world, and that appears to be a really important act of kind of developing their digital play. And I think I've possibly run over time, so apologies for that, but I hope that was interesting, and I'm happy to forward the paper and obviously also take any questions.